Hi, everybody. My name is Derek Bromell, and I'm the Artistic Director of the American Composers Orchestra. Welcome to our Professional Development webinar series, which is co-presented by ACO and the American Composers Forum. Today, it is production and recording for composers. And with us, we have three of the most creative and knowledgeable people in the biz. We have Emmy Award-winning producer and director Habib Azar. We have multi-Grammy Award-winning producer Judith Sherman. And we have my dear colleague and Pulitzer Prize-winning composer Du Yun, along with our moderator John Glover. I want to give a few tech reminders to our audience after welcoming you here. Welcome. Please use the Q&A panel. It's the button at the bottom of your video to ask questions, and we'll try to get to them in the last 15 or 20 minutes. And use the chat function to interact with fellow attendees and tell us where you're calling in from and who you are. It'd be great to know. This panel will be recorded and it'll be available on ACO's YouTube channel and the American Composers Forum website. Thank you so much to the American Composers Forum. We love you. Thanks to the Virginia B. Toolman Foundation. As always, thanks to the New York State Council on the Arts. Thanks for the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And thank you to our individual donors for helping fund this series. And thanks to the ACO staff, especially Aiden Feldkamp, who's done so much work to make this happen. Thanks to Jay Jung, Mosa Tsai, Lindsay Working, and our new president, Melissa Nan. So I'd like to introduce now our moderator, John Glover. He's a composer, producer, curator, man of many talents, director of artistic planning at New York City's Kaufman Music Center. John began his career actually at ACO when he produced the first Sonic Festival in 2011. He's gone on to produce at least a half a dozen other festivals. He's artistic director of the Look and Listen Festival, has served 7 years as the vice president of the Orchestra of St. Luke's Domena Center. He's also an award-winning composer, having written many concert works with a specialty in opera. That's his. That's what he's been working on recently, especially on his opera Stay, which is an immersive work with librettist Kelly Rourke. Welcome to our moderator, John Glover.
That was, I don't think I've done all those things, but thanks, Derek. Welcome everybody to being here. It's amazing to see everybody flooding in the chat. Looks like we've got people from everywhere, from Lake Worth, Florida, New Haven, Connecticut, Chicago, Philly, Minneapolis, Huntsville, Texas. It's great. Thanks all for joining us. I wanted to start this. I mean, there is an embarrassment of riches on this Zoom panel right now. So I thought we would just start with each of our panelists just introducing themselves briefly. And maybe Judith, we could start with you. Not that any of you need any introduction, but I'd love for each of you to just give a little context around your work as we start this discussion.
Is this, okay, so my name is Judith Sherman. I'm a freelance recording producer living in New York. I work with a lot of composers, known and unknown. And I mean, I would say at least 50% of the time when I'm recording, the composer is sitting next to me.
And Habib, maybe you could just introduce yourself a little bit more.
Hi, my name's Habib. I actually went to school for composition, and it was when I met Du Yun in New York that I realized that I was not really going to be a composer and that I should find a different path. That was in like 2005 or something. So I also went to school for directing, and I have kind of cobbled together a sort of career directing and producing music and performing arts on film. And that's sort of what I do.
And Du Yun also needs no introduction, but.
Hi, I am Du Yun. I'm a composer and performer and a great admirer of both Judith, Habib, and John. I'm Derek, and a good old friend with ACO. Habib and I really go way back, and actually seeing him flourish in along so many, since the last decade, actually also encouraged me to think outside of how composer can really, the production side of it, and can the composer be the director? Is there a boundary within that two hats, and so on and so forth? So very glad to be here.
So maybe I'd love to go there, but maybe initially, Judith, I'd love for each you, Judith and Habib, to just share a little bit more in detail. Judith, for you, like what goes into making a recording? Like if we get into the real brass tacks of a composer's come to you or a performer's come to you and said, I want to make an album, what sort of, like, if you were to give a brief summary of like what that journey is to get from that idea to actually producing a recording, what does that look like from your perspective as a producer of recordings?
Well, from the first phone call from a composer or a musician or a label with an idea, it's up to me then, everything in between, to delivering a master. That is finding a venue that is suitable for what it is that's being recorded. If it's a chamber music or solo, I'm also usually the engineer. So my assistant and I lug like 500 pounds of equipment to the hall, set up, build a control room, set up mics, get a sound with the approval of the musicians. I guide the session, that is making sure that everything is, quote, covered. Trying to, one hopes, get the best possible performance on any given day. I then listen through everything, mark a score, edit everything together, send it to the musicians and the composer. They pick at it. I make their requested changes. I send it back just to make sure that this is actually what they want. And very, very often, can you put the first edit back in? Not very often, but yeah, there will be a few of those. And then master it and get it to the label. And every label wants a different version of mastering. And luckily, I have an assistant who can do all of those various things and get it to them in a timely fashion.
I often think, like, especially composers starting out recording, I think one thing that people maybe don't always realize is how crucial, as a producer, having that other set of ears in the room, of someone that you trust and someone that's a deeply musically skilled person who's an objective set of ears, separate from the performer, separate from the composer, that can help guide and shape that part of the process when you're actually in the studio. I feel like that's something that a lot of composers starting out don't realize how crucial that is, or how invaluable that can be.
I'm not sure about the word objective, because I get as emotionally involved in it as the rest, but I'm yet one more emotionally involved person. And I'm sort of mediating between what's on the page, and on the one hand, with the composer, what did you mean by that? That's not clear. And on the other hand, with the musicians saying, I see this, but I'm not hearing it. We're all going in the same direction. Of course, though, with the musicians I've worked with for a very long time, I know what their tastes are. I know what they're looking for. I can, with confidence, say, you're not going to be happy with bar such and such, or from A to B. With somebody new, it's always learning. And usually, most recordings take 3 days. And usually by the end of the third day, I've gotten, or even by the middle of the second day, gotten the message of what is important to this performer or these performers and this composer.
And when you say most recordings take 3 days, is for, like, how much material are you recording minutes wise, in terms of minutes of music, that you think takes around 3 days?
60 to 70 minutes, and depending, string quartets take the longest. As you add more people, the time goes down a little bit. Solo piano takes the least time, usually 2.5 days. They don't have to deal with intonation, or at least it's not their fault. Yeah, I mean, yeah, in other words, a CD's worth of music.
And then Habib, I'm wondering if we could hear the same from you. I mean, it's, you know, focusing on filmmaking and video, but the fact that your expertise is specifically in music-driven video or in documenting performance. Could you just talk about a little more in depth about that, and what are unique considerations you think that come into play when you're filming music as opposed to any other kind of film, whether it be like a short film or a play or, yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah, totally. You know, so my process, I think of myself really mostly as a narrative filmmaker, storyteller. So I'm often getting a project and then trying to understand what the story is behind it. And that's not the only way to work. Obviously, with music, it could be kaleidoscopic. But you kind of look at the restrictions placed on the performance and then come up with a way to effectively translate it to film. Or we use film as, you know, kind of a make us feel good term for video. And often it's multi-camera. So often it's a live performance that I'm capturing. So it's a very specific technique of switching, planning, and then switching cameras live. And I'm going to share my screen. So everything is totally planned out beforehand. Here's the Thomas Addis piece that I just did. You know, you'll plan out every single camera, every single position, where it's going to happen, what's going to happen, and all of your team is going to know exactly what to do, and you're going to make it happen on the fly. And when it's a big orchestra, that's the only way, because their time is very valuable, or it costs a lot of money. And if it's a solo performer or a chamber ensemble, you might have more, or a string quartet, you might have more flexibility to do it a kind of single camera style. And you'll do the same thing. You'll plan it within an inch of its life. How am I going to tell the story of this music or the event or whatever it is? And, you know, oftentimes I'm working in pretty easy, I'd say, not very crunchy and modernist forms. So often there is a very clear story. Like, you know, I did Marnie at the Met with Nico Muhly. There's, you know, you just tell the story, right? But sometimes you have to try and understand what are we doing this? Du Yun, we were supposed to, I think last week before everything hit, film a piece that she premiered with ACO actually, and it was a whole different beast. But again, it's all about how am I going to translate this and bring the intention of the composer into a document.
And then, Du Yun, I mean, especially I'm so intrigued. I mean, your work is, I mean, I don't know if this is the fair word to use, but many disciplines come into play in your work. I feel like you're also a very theatrical thinker and a visual thinker, and I'm really intrigued by your comment about the composer as director, and how that leapt off of meeting Habib. And so I wonder if you could talk about, or start with talking about, just when you're thinking about a new work, or when there's a spark of an idea of a new work, when does the idea of logistics or production come into play for you, or when do you start thinking about that in the process? Is that early on, or how does that work for you?
I will absolutely get back to what you were saying, but I first of all just wanted to say that I always learn from my collaborators, and collaborators can mean so many different meanings and stage. When I worked, I only worked with Judy once on Jenny Cole's and the album, and I was myself performing on it. It was so great to have Judy in the room, because it's not just like she was having an extra ear, because she is so into it, and like 30, I think 15 minutes into it, I realized that she is someone who would really get this piece is really about, and the sound and sonority. So when you are performing, or when you are being composer, when you're not performing, you're very like rattled, and to have someone else to have that kind of assurance is to encourage and to amplify what you can do even more, and what you can even do less, so that from the recording what they're going to sound like. Same as with Habib too. I learned so much about how he looks at lenses, what the stage gonna look like from the audience, from what the stage, the relationship, all those things really just make you realize that it's not about notes on the scores, because in education, you always worry so much about this notation. Not to say that we should not worry about notation, but I think as a professional musicians and artists, when you are trying to engage your work with your audience, this is where we actually talk about how those things gonna make life, right? So right now, I think the production stage is actually at the inception of what I am thinking about. It's very, very early on, because I also have experiences in curating and so on and so forth. So the more the producing work that you do, the more um, uh, empathy you have in terms of funding, in terms of logistics, in terms of how much this gonna cost to bring into this room, and how much that percussion gonna sound like, in what size of that recording studio gonna cost, and can you, so all those things, it's not about submission to the reality, it's about embracing, and it's about engaging um, actively, proactively, with the means that we could have. And this is what I learned as an immigrant, is that whatever means that you could have, we'll make it happen beautifully and with blossom. So instead of thinking reality in a production level is a limitation, but really embracing it, embracing to understanding how many different ways can this work speak and present.
That's fantastic. I wonder, could you expand a little bit on, or maybe a recent project where some of the constraints took the results of the project to a place that you weren't expecting, or to a place that maybe even exceeded where you thought the project might go to?
Let's just start with the project that Habib was talking about, where we lost our shadows. I had this idea. I met with Khaled Jarrah, the Palestinian artist, who took on this trip to went on with a Syrian family, going on a trip from the Greece end to Berlin. And it's about human migration. It's about all that. And then and immediately I know that I wanted to have that as a performing art work, not just a film, not just a thing. And then I was like, I wanted to have voices, and the voices will be like a male voice and a female voice, and then the male voice will be like Alisetti, who is a Qawwali and a raga singer. And then I was like, I wanted the video, right? And then I was like, but then you gotta have like percussion and orchestra. So in a way, it is kind of crazy, but at the same time, it's not, because everything that you realize that you have a reason for those elements to be. So I just proposed this idea to Ed, actually, who is the president at ACO. Actually, that was before, even before he was with ACO, and he really loved the idea, and we just went from there. And when you were talking about difficulties, yes, there are so many difficulties in terms of how to get people in the country, how to get Alicetis with a working visa, how to get Halercam, how to get things. But each of that set of problems, it became actually a huge set of freedoms that the project just framed. And I remember we spent so much time when the premiere comes of the marketing, is like what this piece is. I have no idea what the piece is, you know. So is it triple concerto? No. Is it a video? Like, what is it? But I think as a creator, you don't really need to know what it is, but you need to know this topic needs to talk about, this work needs to exist, and then you figure out what the piece is.
That's great. And I wonder, Habib, I remember when we met briefly before this seminar, one thing that we really wanted to get to, which Duyun alluded to and you alluded to, is that your career path veering off from being a composer into being a filmmaker. And just as somebody who studied as a composer and now works more deeply on the side of the film creation, could you just talk a little bit more about your journey in that, or how you sort of found your way there, and what along the way gave you the tools you needed to more fully understand the film side of what you do?
Yeah, you know, it's actually kind of a crazy story. I got really lucky, but maybe it's nice to hear. I went to school as a composer and as a director, thinking that I was going to write and direct operas, and I, did a few student works. And when I graduated, I got this opportunity to direct soap operas, so like daytime television. And you're 22 years old, and I had a little Volkswagen Beetle from the 70s, and I was going to go out to San Francisco to be an intern at the opera, and instead I turned it around and I went to New York and started directing soaps. And soaps are these multi-camera live to tape is the technique. And I'd never owned a TV, never watched a soap. My parents didn't have cable growing up. Like, I wasn't like anti, but I had no idea. And I remember watching, the soap with some random friend of mine. It's like, oh, I love As the World Turns. And it's like, what? Okay. So I started working as in a kind of high level at a young age as a TV maker. And then when the soap started going off the air, it was like, well, I don't want to do this. I want to make something a little more interesting, a little more important. So I was able, there's not very many people who can do the multi-camera thing and read a score and understand a piece of music. And so I was able to parlay it into that. And this moment when I worked on as an assistant director on one of Duyun's works, we were all kids in New York. And my friend who I went to school was like, I need an assistant. You're going to love Duyun. Come. I was like, well, okay, whatever. I've got my nights clear. And this is sort of the thing about, for me, my entire career is built on saying yes. And listen, it's not for everybody. And I completely respect people who feel that they need to value their time and all that stuff. But I'm kind of the opposite. I'm like, yeah, I'm free. I'll come do it. Be an assistant, take notes. Sure, I've got an Emmy already, but I'll take notes for you and sit and I met Duyun. And all these times that I said yes have like led to great things. So anyway, and then I'm listening to, it was Zola, one of her operas. I don't know if it was her first or not. And I'm sitting there listening to it. I'm like, man, I'm just writing schlock. I have nothing to say. And what Du-Yun is writing is real music. And I'm going to concentrate on the film.
That's not true. But I do have to say that at the time, I had no idea what director should do, because I wrote the story. I'm a composer. I have to perform in it. I have to memorize in it. And then you are working with director who tell you what to do. I'm like, oh, but you don't understand, So there is so much like the just steps that I did not understand, and the tension that I also created unnecessarily. And Habib was so great to kind of mediate that. But I was just so crazy that to think that that was my first opera, and I was already in the PS 122, and 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 sometimes you saying yes is so much power in it, because I was like, yes, of course I'll perform in my own opera, yes, and still without understanding what that really means. But also I think owning up to your mistake is really really powerful too. That owning up to saying that, wow, what I did, like, that was not right, or I wish it would be different. And then so the next project, that would be something that is a little bit more grounded, or things like that, right? Or if when actually Azola is having a moment of revival moment, so when we actually have the moments of revisiting the piece, what could we do differently, and not to have the ego centered around, and how to invite your collaborators, not thinking that those are the professor or the power structure people trying to tell you what to do.
I think it'd be great to hear from all three of you on this. There's some questions starting to come in, which I will address in a minute, but I wanted to say, obviously we're getting, Du-Yun, you're quite far in your career at this point, and have had so many incredible collaborations, including with the folks on this call. But I think part of what we want to try to touch on with the seminar is, especially composers who are just starting out in producing work, whether it's doing their first recording or trying to do a first filmed project. What advice would each of you have for a composer who's maybe earlier in their career, just starting out on trying to figure out how to produce a recording of something, or produce a short filmed performance of something? If they're trying to either do it themselves, or if they can expand a little bit beyond their own equipment they have at home, what's the first place they should look, or what's the thing you think they really need to make sure that they build out the budget on to include?
I would say, I have to tell you a story. Virgil Thompson, I went to a lecture of his many, many years ago. And of course, at the end, question and answer, what does a composer need to do to get his or her music played? And Virgil said, die. Well, I don't think you have to go to those extremes, but what you really need more than anything is musicians who love your music and want to play your music. And I can't tell you how many young composers do not know how to communicate with musicians. And that is a real detriment. I think of Yale had a 2-week seminar every year in the summer for exactly that, teaching young composers to speak with performers. I attended it because my husband, Kurt Macumber, was teaching at it, and that's where I met Eighth Blackbird. They were a student ensemble there. But there was one composer whose music entailed long silences. And this pianist did, I have to say, a beautiful job of bridging these silences and making a bridge in the midst of nothing. That wasn't nothing, it was silence. But the composer then to speak to the musician said, well, that song was supposed to be 20 seconds. You only did 18. And I'm thinking, what? So in bridging the gap between what you have in your brain and what the musician is doing, the first thing obviously is praise what has happened correctly or to your liking. And you have to know for yourself how much freedom you will allow a performer in interpretation and where things have to stop for you. The thing you will have to nicely be able to say, this is what's important to me in this piece, and then let it go. What's weird is that composers who are also performers sometimes are really great at speaking to performers because they know how tough it is. On the other hand, I've had some, and these are generally senior composers, who have this idea of how they would perform it, and there is no leeway. And I don't think that does your piece any good, because in the end, it's really the piece that you're grooming, that you're pushing along, that you are presenting to the world. In terms of making a recording, oh, there's one other thing I have to say. Those of you who work in MIDI, do remember that live instruments can't do what MIDI will tell you it can. For instance, there is no way you are going to be able to balance a bass clarinet with an alto flute. It's not going to happen. You can't. Fortissimo for an alto flute is pianissimo for the bass clarinet. And incidentally, bass clarinet and piccolo sound great together. So if you're working in MIDI, do also go to concerts and hear what actual instruments can do. Because I end up in recording sessions trying to balance things that just will not balance. And it's since the advent of MIDI, that has become endemic. So just because you can boost an alto flute to fortissimo doesn't mean it will happen in the real world. All right, so you find musicians who want to record your piece. And now the logistics start. And for young composers, one of the things how can I say this? Ask the school that you graduated from for help. You'd be surprised how often if they cannot give you money towards something, they can give you in-kind things. You can use our hall for free. We will give you the piano. We will give you the tuning. That has just saved you about $5,000. So that is the people who have what's the word I'm looking for? Who want your career to be a big career, who have skin in the game, shall we say, like your school, like your professors, are often a good place to start. And of course, there are so many granting agencies now, many more than even a few years ago, that you can go to. But you start with the musicians. You start with having a few good performance tapes, even if it's on an iPhone, that you can write a grant with. The other thing I want to say is the room that you record in is as much an instrument as the instruments the musicians are playing on. You put a wind player or a singer, or really any musician, but especially a wind player or a singer, in a dead room, and it's not going to be good for them. They will overplay. They will. Oh, okay. Another story. I work with Kronos Quartet, well, from 1985 for a while. So we've got maybe this many CDs on the shelf, and we were recording at Skywalker Sound, which is a gorgeous acoustic. in December. It rains in California in December. And the main transformer for the ranch was hit by lightning. It went up in beautiful purple and orange, and that everything's on what's the word? I'm losing words. The power transform, the gas things that all turned on. You have a half hour to save your project, be it the films or the recordings or whatever. You have a half hour to save your project and turn everything off in the correct order. Okay, so now here we are in the middle of a project. One of the collaborators has to leave in 2 days to go back home. And across the street, there is a little studio. Kronos knows that they cannot try to make this studio, they cannot play in that studio the way they play in Skywalker Sound. They know it is not going to answer them. And yet they could not make their ears as professional and as accomplished and experienced as they are, they could not make their ears they couldn't not overplay, trying to get the room to say something. So when you're looking to do a recording, if you want it to sound good, you have to go into a good acoustic. There's no way around it. And this doesn't mean that there aren't recording studios that have a sound, but most recording studios are a dead room and no acoustic music is going to sound good in those places. I could ramble on for quite a while, but those are the things that I find right off the bat you cannot do without. That is, musicians committed to your music and a decent sound environment to put them in, to make them sound good too. They don't want to sound bad.
I just want to say that was awesome. That was totally worth the price of admission right there. That story and advice was.
Thank you, Habib.
Agreed. I mean, and also there's such a connection there, Judith, between what you and Habib and Duyun are saying, and Duyun talking about, I'm just thinking about Duyun, you talking about composer as director, but also that if that core of the idea isn't there, like you start there and then you figure it out. And I think Judith, that's the other side of the same coin of if you don't have the musicians with you that are really committed to the music, or if you're not having the music making part of it down, then you start there and then you figure out how you're going to get it recorded. But you have to, you really start there and then you work out from there.
Can I tell you a story? Steve Reich is very good at, if something is not working for a musician, how can I make it still how I want it to sound and not have your fingers all twisted up. And he doesn't publish a score until after a recording session because so many changes get in articulation and sometimes notes. But my favorite Steve Reich story, and I love sharing this with the world, there was, at that point, he had only 2 orchestral pieces, and we were going to London to record them, and Tilson Thomas and the London Symphony. And the first one, I get there and I call Steve to say I've arrived, and he's having a fit. And I said, what's the matter? He said, Tilson Thomas has reorchestrated the last movement. I have no authority to say this, but I said to Steve, look, we'll go to the concert tomorrow night. If you don't like it, we'll cancel the session. Then I called Bob Hurwitz and told him this. So of course, the orchestration works so much better than Steve's. Okay, and we recorded it and everything. Okay, fade to black. 2 years later, we go back to finish the album. Steve and I are both at the first rehearsal. And Michael is saying, okay, second oboe, I want you doubling the second violins there. And then he realizes Steve is behind him. He says, Steve, is that all right? And Steve says, Michael, pretend I'm dead. Because obviously Michael knew the orchestra better than Steve did. So yeah, so in terms of don't get so this is the way I wrote it and this is the way it has to be. You will learn with experience that sometimes when you're working with the musicians, things are going to have to change.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. I always think that as a composer, just, like stop capitalizing the C with that words, because I'm just that attitude. If life itself can have so many forms and so many iterations, right? You could go there, and you can never really control. So why when we are dealing with our work, we pretend everything can be controlled, which I think cannot be further from the reality that we live in. Not to say that you cannot have your own vision. I really believe you can still have the same vision, but then it's about how to engage with people whose aesthetic, whose artistic value that you share and respect, so that you will be in a great hands, and then let them shine, and you just need to stop existing for sometimes, or thinking that this is your chance of your work having another moment of revival or remix session. And so that is the power of living art, so that we don't just be this is this. And in terms of funding such, if we cannot find funding, start from if you can play the instrument or not, if you can sing it or not. That was actually how I was doing that, and then so that you start from a recording you could manage, and then using that recording, you can then apply to the grants. You can then apply to other presenters or programmers, or you start your own ensemble, you start your own series production company.
And don't be afraid to ask your fans. Many times the answer will be yes, I'll give you $1,000 toward that. Or, if you have people who are following your work, they might not be huge grants, but there are people who are invested in having you succeed. And so, you'd be surprised. I never say no for somebody else. In other words, so-and-so would never perform my work, or so-and-so, some big performer, or so-and-so probably wouldn't give me anything. But you'd be surprised how often you think, oh, that's never going to happen. And the answer turns out to be yes.
But don't you think that we have to put a little bit joy, sorry to use that word, like into, because you have to stop thinking that you're using people or you're being used, right? But you are actually together are making things happen, and in that itself is a magical moment. So how to create that space with people you love to create that space with, and that itself is empowering and agency and all that, the fancy words that we love to use.
Two of my favorite words are magic and joy. I'm going into a session hoping to capture magic and joy for myself. When those things happen, those magical moments, they're exclamation points all over my score.
But do pay people, yes.
Yes, do pay people. Oh my heavens, yes.
So speaking of that, there's a couple really, a couple questions that I thought we could go to just now that we're getting to 3:45. A couple really specific brass tacks questions. One around paying people, I think that would be great. Here's a very specific question, Judith, I think is for you. Is from MTC Cons Hohaken Studio 6. I'm not sure what the actual name is, but that's the name on Zoom.
Hohaken, it's down the street from me.
Aha. So wondering what a good starting budget to think about would be for a 10-minute solo or duo piece recording project when you're thinking about the composer, performer, and recording engineer if the venue is at home. What's a rough budget that you would think about for that?
Did you say the recording is a home? Is
It's
that
at home, yeah, not in a venue. So maybe you just wouldn't do it.
probably not? But I mean, unless this person, I have recorded in quote homes, but which have their own performance venues in them. But those are not the kinds of homes most composers own. But in this case, of course, if you have the recording equipment, you can rent mics. Usually the rule of thumb is a day's rental is 1% of the cost of the mic. And I think it's 4 days or 5 days is a week. So, you know, you pay for, so it's like a $2,000 mic. You can figure out what those are if you're going to rent mics. If you're in a home, do not use omnidirectional mics. Use cardioid because you want to block out all the first reflections you possibly can. Because the first reflection, be it whichever is the narrowest, wall, ceiling, floor to ceiling, whatever, is going to make the room sound just that big. No matter how big it is this way, if it's got a low ceiling, it's small. So you want to block out as many first reflections as you can. That way you will be able to add reverb. But if you use Omni mics, then all that you hear all the first reflections, and that's not so great. What else can I tell you about recording in a home? You have to play games with the microphones. With the Duo, I generally would use, I don't know what the instrumentation is, but generally I would use 2 mics, 3 mics, so that the mic in the middle, in effect, stereo mics this person and stereo mics that person. Again, I don't know what the instrumentation is. If it's piano, then we're in a whole other, it's a whole other wax.
That's already, I think, a lot of really invaluable information. And then to shift over, a question more related to video. This comes from Krista Connolly, and she's wondering, Habib, recommendations for how to find video collaborators, or if you're a composer who wants to do some video work and you're not sure where to reach out to, what are some good resources for that?
That's a great question. Man, it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard. The unfortunate fact is, and we talked about this before, but not here, is a filmmaker who doesn't understand music, it's really hard for them to do a good job. So this changes if we're talking about a solo performer, right? So if we're talking about a solo piece, then my advice to you would be to go find somebody whose film work you find exciting, and, you know, go wild, because you can kind of tell the story of you can figure out how to tell the story of the music if you get the coverage. So, you know, film schools, or friends of yours who are making things, or friend made a short film and you really like their work, and, you know, you're a duo or a very small chamber piece. But when you get to like a string quartet or more, understanding what is happening in the music, I think, becomes paramount to the quality of the video. If you do, I can shoot something on an iPhone better than a filmmaker with a huge budget who doesn't understand music, because it's about storytelling. It's about understanding that the cello is conversing with the second violin here, and we have to set up a shot or make sure that we have the coverage for that, so that when we get to the edit, it's going to sing. So my advice from string quartet on is to find a musician who is interested in video, and sort of take a chance on them. Like, hey, will you film this? And like, we'll just go and try and edit it together. I just did this project, actually, sorry, last thing. Renee Fleming runs this song series, master classes for lead, like songs, at Carnegie Hall. And we just did video projects because, COVID, and what else are we going to do? And so I worked on videos with everyone, and we kind of storyboarded and made videos. But one group were like, we're going to go do it ourselves. And I was like, okay, so download this app on your iPhone, and you know how to get the sound, because musicians are usually better at that than I am. And they edited it in like iMovie, and they shot it on their iPhone. And it is the most incredible and exquisite, like it's much better than the work that I did. And it's because it understood what the story was. So my advice is stay away from video people who don't understand music, and go the opposite way, unless it's a soloist or something smaller.
And there's a quick follow-up question to that, Habib. That's an amazing story, and I think totally invaluable. And there's a question, do you remember what the app was that you had them download?
Oh yeah, so if you've got a iPhone, or I think any phone, it's called Filmic Pro. And I'll type it in, Filmic Pro. This is an invaluable application. It costs like $15 for your phone. So a phone is actually an incredible device for filming. It actually has a brilliant camera on it. Great lens. It's really, really excellent. But the application, the camera application, dumbs it down reasonably. So you won't shoot in actually 24 frames a second, because it'll have a variable frame rate to understand how to blah, blah, blah. Filmic Pro gives you control over the camera. It kind of unlocks all the potential of the camera, and it's kind of an advanced tool for it. So you can change the color space, you can change the frame rate, you can do focus manually rather than just hitting a button. You can actually rack focus and all these things, and change the aperture, and choose to under or overexpose an image, whereas you're kind of locked in on the camera.
There is. I do want to make sure I'm addressing everybody's questions, because I appreciate all of you joining. And there are a couple of questions about funding resources for recording projects, and I think rather than really directing that question with this group of panelists, I'd just say ACF, who's obviously co-presenting this conversation. If you're not a member of ACF, they have great resources for funding and where different grants are. And just to amplify what Judith and Duyan and Habib are saying, which is that before you start getting those big grants, start with the music, start with the musicians that are around you, start with your iPhone. You really start with the core of what you're trying to do and build out with what's possible with what you have. And then, but in terms of funding, I would say resources like ACF are great for tracking what grant opportunities there are. And of course, there's also New Music USA. So I just want to make sure I'm addressing that, because there's a series of people asking that, and that would be, I think, the recommendation. Duyan, for you, I've got a question from John Lane about talking about, he, as a performer, had been recording these large-scale percussion solo works of Peter Garland, and it was on the Starkland label. It was his first time realizing sort of what all can come together when there's a label behind the project, and now he's thinking more about documenting his own work and his own competitions. And having had that experience, seeing what it was like for Peter Garland working with a label, he's wondering about advice for working with labels. Should you really seek out a label support? Is it better to create your own label when you're self-producing your recordings, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think Judith can answer better than I do, but I do want to say that the support from label is going to be smaller and smaller at the current economy as we are living in, and then they might also have a lot of limitations of what you do if you are not an artist that they're familiar with. So there's a lot of negotiations right there as well, and also then it's the copyrights. So who owns the master right and everything. So I'll let Judith to answer that. But I do want to say about the production thing is sometimes that do not, if you have a 10 minutes piece, if you wanted to have a visual, don't think that you can just do, it has to be 10 minutes all video things. There are so many different and creative ways in which that you could actually think. Can this be a 3D scans? Can this be something else? Can this be all act? Can this be an abstract? So for instance, the Long Beach Opera, they did the Agano, and I was there. And so many people are doing so well with their own shooting and with a shoestring budget, and the visuals does look good. So I actually, when I was mentoring that, I was like, if you have a few $100s, make sure that you put into editing, make sure that you put into so that it looks good at the final product. And as a composer, don't think that if is there maybe an excerpt of your piece that can be with visuals, not the whole 20 minutes, not the whole 40 minutes, if you do not have the means. So Judith can answer that question.
Maybe I can. I think owning the master is very important. And registering your ownership of the master is also very important. There are some most labels, if you produce the master, pay for all of it, and the label agrees to put it out, they will take ownership. But that is negotiable. Everything's negotiable. Just remember that. Never say no for somebody else. There's a label called Avi in London, and their policy is that the musicians will always own the master. Why this is important is that labels go out of business, they sell their catalogs, and you have no control. If they decide not that this is not going to be out in the world anymore, if they're not going to repress it, republish it, you have no control. You cannot then put it out by yourself. As to going with there are many things that are good with a label. They will oversee doing a beautiful package, and but many of them do not have really good publicity arms anymore. And you can go to a place like Disc Makers, who will work with you and give you a beautiful package, and then you can spend your money on hiring a publicist and getting radio play and getting it out into the world on social media. It's really a toss-up. If you end up having several discs on the same label, and they can publicize them all together, that adds up. But if this is your first album, you might shop it around and see what people say, what they offer. But also know that, and many labels will charge you to put it out, or say you must buy so many discs. That's their way of making money on what it costs them to put it out. But you should look at all the options, and putting it out by yourself. If you go to Disc Makers, you can. I think they're connected with CD Baby in some way, but you have to tell them right away at the beginning, I want to put this out on CD Baby, and have you set up a link for that. They're just. I can't come down on one side or the other. I get asked this a lot, and it really goes, I really go through a lot of question and answering with the composers or the musicians as to how they want to do this. But publicity end is the big thing. And if a label is not going to do really great publicity for you, so that it's out there, then maybe it's better you find a good publicist and put it out yourself.
There's also, I would add to that one about labels. There's also some smaller independent labels that are very artist driven. One I can think of is like New Focus Recordings is a great example. Dan Lapel, who runs that, where he is providing some support, but it's flexible and scalable, and the artist retains everything. So New Focused Recordings is another great resource to look at, where he'll do everything from the smallest work that a label might do to all the way out to hiring a publicist, or you can bring in your own publicist. So there are some great labels like that that can scale depending on the scope of the project or the budget you have. So New Focus Recordings is another I'd add there. We're just past 4 o'clock actually. And I mean, this panel of these 3 people, we could spend another 4 hours of unbelievable wisdom on how to think about production and how to create documents of your work and where to go. But does anybody have any closing thoughts for us before we sign off and bring Derek back on here? This has been an incredible day. Thank you so much for your time, all 3 of you.
My only closing thought is thank you, everybody, for sharing your time with us. There are so many of you, and it's really awesome that you came.
Yeah, and I thank you all also for people who are tuning in, because it's just so wonderful and powerful to see, like, we're still making creative work and it's and with urgency as well. So artists is often find the holes from the society that we live in, and this is really wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, all of you. This has been, I'm going to sit at Duyun's and Habib's feet and learn things.
Derek, you're muted.
Somebody had to do it, right?
It's 2021. Someone has to.
Have somebody be muted. There's got to be one. So I was willing to take the fall. Thank you all so much. Thanks to our audience also, as Habib so elegantly said. And audience, please look out for an email from us with a link to the recording of this and post-webinar survey, which is always helpful to us. Check the chat for the link, which I think Aiden has put in there. Please take a few minutes to take that survey so that we can tailor our future programs to your desires and needs. Join us next week, Wednesday at 3 p.m. EST, that's Eastern Standard Time, for another webinar, which is going to be about entrepreneurship and creating ensembles, which overlaps very much with this one. Moderator Frank J. O'Terry from New Music USA, who you probably know about, and panelists, violist and radio host, curator Nadia Sirota, president and artistic director of Sphinx, Afa Dworkian, and composer, pianist, and interdisciplinary artist Sugar Vendel. So I want to thank the ACF, the American Composers Forum staff, especially Billy Lackey, Laura Kreider, Damian Strange, who've done so much work, and our friend Vanessa Rose, their prez. And thank you to ACO staff, as I said at the beginning, and to our panelists. Judith, thank you so much. Great to see you. Duyun and Habib. Thank you so much, John Glover, our moderator. This panel will be recorded. It was recorded, actually, I should say. It's already recorded, too late. It will be available on ACO's YouTube channel and the American Composers Forum website. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, ACO.